Welcome to another episode of the Wheel of Time Diaries, this time episode 30, the second and also final episode for New Spring, the prequel novel to the series. This book was fantastic. Now, at the time that I'm recording this is actually nearly a week before this, or it is exactly a week before this video will be coming out, because I finished reading the book today, the day that the first episode came out. I definitely plowed my way through the book, reading in right about 1 week, I believe, exactly 1 week of reading, essentially cranking out over 13 hours. Last week I did nearly 8 hours. This week I did 5.5 hours to finish off the book. Reading in that time chapters 15 through 26 plus the epilogue, and it turned out the spot that I stopped at for the first diary on the book was exactly perfect, because not only did it switch to land POVs after not really having any for most of the first like 3/5 of the book, the point that I was at when I recorded that first video, but it jumped ahead in time by a few months as well. On top of that, it took us to a point where we're in another location following Lan and Moraine separately, and basically the convergence of their two stories, as well as including a little bit of Swan in there, including a little bit more of the intrigue that we're used to from the main series based off of those Aes Sedai POVs. The young Aes Sedai training POVs, rather, you might say. We're talking about like Egwene and Nynaeve and such. But New Spring was genuinely great. Not only did I have a great time reading this week, maybe a little bit less enjoyment overall than last week, I would say, but not necessarily to an extreme or disappointing level, because I would rate this book basically 4.5 stars. I gave it 5 on Goodreads because it was great and I really enjoyed it that much. The only problem that I really had with it was that this final third, this final act, really was a little bit slower than I would prefer overall, just on account of Lan's POV kind of breaking things up in a way that was kind of off. I know I was saying last week that I wanted a little bit more of the Lan POV, but it turned out that his POV was kind of just okay, and most of what made it good was basically just in the final moments of the book, or rather the last several chapters in which things actually became a little bit more important. The first couple POVs, or the first couple chapters of Lan's POV that I read this week that I started off with, were a little bit more confusing because they jumped to a whole new time, they jumped to a new location, they jumped to a new something that I was like, I don't know exactly what's going on here. So it kind of discombobulated me just a little bit, not necessarily in a bad way, but was looking a little bit rougher there for a second or two. But in the end, Jordan managed to pick it all up and make everything work together. My general consensus at the end of this reading is that New Spring is a pretty underrated book for various different reasons. Maybe this is because the vast majority of people who read it after Crossroads of Twilight, when they would like to be reading something different. But at the time that I read this one, I think it worked perfectly for me, not just because of the way that Moraine's story kind of ended in The Fires of Heaven, because that's the most recent book in the main series that I've read up to this point, but also because of just the fact that I enjoy these characters and being able to jump to these POVs and get that expansion upon those 5 books, those characters, the plots, kind of get a little bit of backstory for some of the things that happened obviously 20 years before, well, obviously before the series, but it turns out about 20 years before Eye of the World happens. Just is really, really great stuff. A lot of that, of course, I did cover last week in, the White Tower and Swan and Moraine training and all of that material, but this back half also included plenty of good material on that front as well. And arguably more importantly, not just was New Spring great on its own, I lament even more the fact that this was going to be the first of a prequel trilogy or a short prequel series otherwise of a sort that Jordan wanted to write, and that this is the only part that we got, because it sets up a lot of things that would have been really great to get to see on the page, especially leading all the way up until the time of Eye of the World. And I would say the ending of this book really punched that point home. But I think that's basically all that I really need to say at the beginning of the spoiler-free. All the rest of the spoiler-free discussion that I'm going to feel super inclined to talk about for New Spring is going to be in the review that I post probably in August, I believe is when it's slated to come out, middle of August or so. And I'm going to obviously review the book there. I'm going to record that video right as soon as I'm done with this video. So, you know, that's just how things are going to go. As for the moment now, let's actually talk a little bit of spoilers stuff. Of course, we left off last week at the end of chapter 14 with Moraine escaping the White Tower and the New Amberlin taking the place after Tamara died. Mysteriously, Moraine searching for the Dragon Reborn on her own, basically going off to do her own thing because she couldn't be stuck in the tower any longer. And the book picks up when I started with chapters 15 and 16 with land POVs, sure, featuring the, you know, his character plus two other characters named Rhine and Bukama, I believe, are their names, and that might not be how they're pronounced, but they're basically in the country of Kandor, which is a good bit away from Tarvalon, and this also happens to be around the area that Moraine is at. Who would have thought? Coincidences, but basically you're following these characters as they're heading back into the capital of the region, for, you know, whatever post-war reasons that they have for doing so. Lan in particular is going to be meeting another woman that he knows, his lover will say. That's basically what he's doing. That's basically what they're doing in their traveling. But aside from this little short glimpse again into Lan's POV, you jump back to Moraine and actually have a few unfortunate circumstances occur for her character, because she happens to bump into a couple of the Aes Sedai from the White Tower while she is also in this Kandor region, and that also includes an infamous Aes Sedai known amongst the tower called Cadsuane. I believe that's how her name is pronounced, Cadsuane. And I think this is the character that one of my friends was asking. I'm curious to see what you'll think about a character who you're introduced to in this book that, you know, other people would be introduced to via other means, in other ways in the main series, because of the fact that I read this after Fires of Heaven rather than after book 7 or 10, as far as that's concerned. But Cadsuane is an interesting type of very villain-esque seeming character. Even though she's not like explicitly one, she definitely comes off as one, particularly to Moraine and the way that she views her. She's a green Aes Sedai who's very well known in the tower. She's apparently the most powerful Aes Sedai, but she kind of just comes and goes. There was a period of time 2 years prior to this book that people thought that Cadsuane was dead because she just hadn't been seen or heard from for a very long time. So there's interesting repercussions that come with those characters. But the fact that Moraine bumps into all these characters is an interesting event. Basically, Moraine has to bend the knee of sorts to Cadsuane and basically agree to be stuck in this town that they're in for a little while until the two other Aes Sedai that she bumped into, Laurel and Marion, are deciding to head into the capital, because that's where Moraine's also going. So, you know, there's some little Aes Sedai political machinations going on under here that aren't necessarily super important for the moment, but the point is that Moraine is supposed to be stuck here, but she does manage to make an escape, much like she makes an escape from Tarvalon. So she's kind of using her wit and her intelligence to get out of this situation, being like, no, I'm going to go do my own thing anyway. So she starts heading in to the capital, but when she goes to leave this town, she notices that there are some soldier-looking people waiting at the gates to leave town as well, and she ends up following them a lot of the way to the capital. And this group of people is, of course, comprised of Lan and Bukama and Rhine. And there's some entertaining interactions between these characters, this little group meetup, that I really enjoyed, that I thought was pretty worth spending time with. I found it entertaining, like I said, even though Moraine comes off as a little bit childish in the eyes of Lan. I enjoyed seeing the disparate POVs. Moraine, the way that she views Lan versus how Lan kind of acts and just generally thinks in his POV versus the other way around, how Lan sees Moraine versus how Moraine kind of behaves in her POVs. Just Jordan's writing doesn't get enough credit a lot of the time, in my opinion, and this book definitely showcased a lot of that, not just in the very minor, brief, like Swan POV that occurred in during the portion of reading that I covered in last week's diary, but also in this section, the portion that I read for this week's diary that contained, Lan and Moraine going back and forth, the way they view each other. You get a lot of really interesting perspective between the two of them that I just really enjoyed reading. I really thought it was great. And this journey especially had a lot of those moments, even if some of it was a little bit immature and kind of childish and very odd sorts of ways. But basically the group makes their way to the capital of Kandor, and there they split up. They go their separate ways, Lan and his group basically going into the heart of the capital itself with the rulers and interacting, doing their kind of thing there, whatever's going on in there. But then there's also Moraine on her hand, where she's also talking to more people, searching for Swan, because Swan managed to find her in the town before, and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with those two. And because Swan had escaped the White Tower so she could find Moraine, and she did, and then they're meeting up in the capital now because they weren't going to be able to leave together on account of Moraine's encounter with the other Aes Sedai there, which I had forgotten to mention. There's some interesting stuff. So you have both of these threads kind of coming together in this town, but you also have basically all of the major named characters of the book who yet live, all things considered, consolidated into this one section, this one place. And that makes for the rise of very, very subtle political notes that Moraine and Swan are able to put together into figuring out that, this is Black Aja type stuff. They're actually able to admit that this is Black Aja stuff. This is stuff that they touched on at the end of my reading from last week's diary, but becomes very obvious here given Cadsuane, her behavior, who Moraine assumes is probably Black Aja, but they also have to assume that maybe some of the other Aes Sedai are Black Aja as well, and they don't really know who to trust. They don't know to trust anybody, so they only really trust each other, which is a dynamic that you kind of see play out in the main series, of course, the way that Swan and Moraine only really trust each other there in the Shadow Rising, the kind of deliberations you get there, the brief ones, the notes that you get through some of the other POVs that you see before, of course, Swan is ousted from the Amyrlin in the main series, but you get to see some of that, how some of those dynamics play out in this book. Like I said, very interesting material. But a lot of this culminates into Jordan's pretty standout style of all of a sudden a climax kind of happens. You get like a chapter of buildup where it's just like, okay, tensions are rising, I can sense a climax is about to happen, and then in the next chapter it just boom kind of happens all of a sudden. That's what happened here in the last few chapters of the book, where here in the capital, while getting information, while Swan is trying to communicate with other people undercover, trying to get information, and Moraine is acting as an Aes Sedai to try to speak to the noble figures to try to get some information before realizing that Lan is here, so that she tries to just disappear, so that Lan doesn't see her, because that could cause complications, that whole sort of thing. There's a lot of this type of scheming and maneuvering going on, all the way up until the point that Moraine notices, or rather comes across, Marion, the other Blue Aja Aes Sedai, and is very suspicious of some stuff. So she decides, okay, I guess I'm just going to go to Lan on purpose now and have him recruit one of the other guys to spy on Marion, attempt to spy on her discreetly to try to, snuff out whether Marion's Black Aja or not, just as a sort of precaution. And this turns out very poorly, we'll say, because Bukama, who is the one that Lan basically sicks on Marion, is killed by Rhine, who turns out to be a dark friend working with the Black Aja, who is Marion, and Marion attempts to kill Lan as well. Basically, it turns out under the guise of just killing all of the men who have extreme luck or who are noted to be lucky in the area, because that's one of the traits of what should be the Dragon Reborn. The Black Aja have gotten wind that the Dragon Reborn has been reborn, but they don't know how old he is. They don't know when he was born or anything. So they're just going around slaughtering men at this point who have any form of potential to be the Dragon Reborn, and that includes some of these other soldiers who were lucky and the nobles of the palace, who happen to have extreme luck, such as a child. The climactic moment happens when Lan is nearly murdered and his friend is murdered, where he actually goes to confront Moraine himself, saying, I think you did this to me because, well, you're the only one who could have. But then it's like, okay, well, the other Aes Sedai actually could have. So the two of them decide to go then together to the, secret spot of the noble figure currently present in the capital, where a slaughter kind of happens, where Marion kills the noble and the noble's child, and Ryan also dies in combat against Lan, and Moraine nearly dies, Lan nearly dies. So it's a pretty big sequence, and I really enjoyed the chapter. It was really, really, really great. It was just executed very well for this kind of blow up kind of climax. Marion, of course, is also inadvertently killed in the process, so the only people who survive this climactic battle sequence here at the very end of the book are Lan and Moraine. They sort of attempt to go their separate ways after this, after kind of dealing with the fallout. The fact that such major figures have been murdered is pretty big, so the two of them are able to kind of get out, but Swan and Moraine are basically deciding, we've got to still find the Dragon Reborn. We've kind of decided that the Black Aja, like I said just a bit ago, this was all revelations that were discussed between Swan and Moraine at the very end of the book. It's like, okay, well, the Black Aja doesn't know who the Dragon Reborn is either, but they don't know when he was born. We know that, so we've still got to search for him. So they basically make the plan that Moraine is going to search physically in places for the Dragon Reborn over the next 20 years until she eventually finds Rand in Eye of the World, but that Swan is also going to go back to the White Tower, and we know in the 20 years between this that she becomes Amyrlin, the Amyrlin seat, which is a story that I really would have loved to see, but we'll touch on that just a little bit later. This is how chapter 26, the last chapter of the book, ends, but the epilogue after that has Moraine re-encountering Lan to say, yeah, well, you don't really have anything else that you could really be doing. You've just shirked off the sort of duty, because Lan has this reputation of being the king of Malkier, even though there hasn't been one for a very long time. Lan demands to know why the king died, because he was supposedly under the protection of Aes Sedai. Moraine tells him at one point, actually reveals that fact to him, so he trusts her a little bit, but she goes and takes Lan for warder, asks him if he will do it, and he finally decides to accept. This was the emotional moment of the book for me, was the bond that was formed between these two in the epilogue, because it was done really poignantly and with a respect for what had just happened in the climax, with respect for the characters, and with respect for the kind of coldness that was between the characters, and that kind of still exists there but is starting to melt away in the wake of the bond and Moraine actually doing the bond. It all really worked perfectly. So the book ends with these two now having a bond, and they're going to go search for the Dragon Reborn together, because that's what Moraine plans to do, while Swan heads back to the White Tower. That's essentially how the book ends. It's not a super complicated or super intricate plot, but it was good, and it was definitely good enough for my tastes. I enjoyed it. I thought it was super worthy. Really, I thought the book was worthy. But the point that I wanted to make, and I'm going to actually make a new section for right now, the timestamps, to actually have this point, basically kind of a semi-spoiler discussion on why I'm sad that this prequel is the only prequel that exists. I would have loved for Jordan to be able to do more, and that's because there are sort of 3 threads left hanging. I did 4 because I had my thumb out, but you know what I'm trying to say, because I said 3. You're left with Swan going back to the White Tower. We know she becomes Amerlin at some point. Being able to explore that storyline would have been really, really cool. We're left with Moraine and Lan, who are to search for the Dragon Reborn. Being able to see more escapades and more searchings for those two would be really enjoyable, especially as far as like finding Tavern are concerned. Basically, having them do searches all the way up until they decide to come through to the Two Rivers, up to Eye of the World would have been really interesting, because then you could get their sort of internal discussion, their internal reactions to coming across Matt and Rand and Perrin being like, wait a minute, something big is here. This is the Dragon Reborn kind of thing. So it would have been really great to see that. But I think the one that I would have also really liked to see was, I had heard that there was also plans for part of the prequel to include some POV of Tam, who is basically Rand's adoptive father, finding Rand and bringing him back to the Two Rivers and having some of Rand's childhood in here. That would have been some really great material as well. You could have mixed all of this really great. Even, like, I don't know how it would have been structured. I genuinely have no idea. I couldn't begin to guess. If it were me, I would guess it would be a book probably twice as long as New Spring. So more like the size of, say, like the Dragon Reborn in terms of word count. You have a book like that explores these three storylines. You have, you know, the Tam and Bran stuff growing up. You also have searches from Moraine and Lan getting ever closer to finding the Dragon Reborn. You also have Swan's journey in the tower. Maybe this could be split into two different books depending on how you timed this stuff. I don't even know, but like, I would have loved to see more is what I'm trying to say, and I'm really, really sad we can't. Like, that is such a bummer. It really is just such a bummer. I really enjoyed New Spring. It was great. I'm glad to have read it. I'm really glad I decided to read it when I did. I think it's actually a really great spot to do it, especially after the way that Moraine seems to die in the Fires of Heaven. I'm still not 100% sure if I'm convinced that's what happens there. It probably is what happens there, but I'm still a little bit dubious on that point. But whether or not that's the case, like I said, I've only read through book 5. If things are revealed over the next 5 books in the series, don't say them in the comments, please, because I would like to experience those for myself. The point is, following this sort of death sequence from Moraine, going back and jumping into the earlier story for her character in New Spring was something that I really enjoyed being able to do, and I think it was totally worthy of it. So yeah, that's 2 diaries in a row that I did basically without consulting notes for the most part. I think that did okay. I think that covered most of what I wanted to cover and actually talk about in this video. I probably lining out more or less the events that happened was probably a bit rough, but my opinions are the same regardless of whether my execution of actually talking about the plot points or not was very good. But thank you for watching this video. Like I said, probably mid-month in August, so here in a few weeks, I'll have a spoiler-free review of the book, kind of talking about a lot of these points in a less spoilery context, but I'll also probably include where this falls in my sort of rough, unconfirmed ranking of the series so far. That's going to be an interesting one, and I think it's not going to have certain people, it's going to have plenty of people upset, because some of my previous rankings have already had people upset, but that's besides the point. That'll be in a few weeks here. Thank you for watching this video. If you did, I'll be back in the next one, whatever that may be, because I really don't know what it is at this point. I've had to reschedule or reshuffle my video schedule for the rest of the summer several times over the last few weeks, so I really don't know. Whatever the next video is, it'll be whatever that is. This review will come out in about 2-3 weeks, somewhere in that time period. So I hope you're excited for that. Thank you again for watching. I'll be back in the next one.